In this lecture, we used indifference curves to figure out how many hours people want to work. In some ways, it looked like what we did before, when we talked about people's preferences over cookies and slices of pizza. But I also used a few more tricks without calling much attention to them. I want to explore these now, because they're very useful for economists. If you know how to use them, they let you do much more interesting stuff than just looking at pizza versus cookies. First, we introduced a new type of utility function for our model. In the past, we always used a function where consumers' utility depended on the consumption of two goods, such as cookies and pizza. But in this lecture, we use a utility function that's dependent on leisure and consumption, which covers all types of consumption. Now, we don't distinguish goods like cookies and pizza anymore. Instead, we lump all goods into one category. Then, instead of the trade-off being between two types of goods, the trade-off is between leisure and consumption of all possible goods. Now, a realistic utility function would have hundreds of inputs, ranging from leisure to pizza to cookies to airline tickets to cars to houses to everything you might consume. But as you can imagine, this would be incredibly hard to work with. So what we do instead in our simplified model is proceed in steps that allow us to model a set of two-sided trade-offs as opposed to one giant trade-off with hundreds of sides. Here, for example, we model the two-way trade-off of consumption and leisure to figure out how hard you work. The downside is we can't say anything about whether you consume more pizza or cookies. We can only talk about total consumption and total hours worked. The upside is that we have a workable framework to analyze how much someone decides to work. The other upside is that once we know how much you decide to work, we know your income. This means we know your budget constraint. And as we discussed for the consumer theory part of the course, we can only know how many cookies and pizzas you'll buy if we know your budget constraint. So this is our first trick. Instead of modeling every possible input that could affect utility, we looked at total consumption. This makes our life much easier, and it will tell us what your budget constraint is. Then down the road, we can address other questions like which specific goods you'll consume. The second trick is that we learned about modeling the opposite of what we care about. This lecture was about labor supply. How much do people work? But look at our model. We weren't modeling how much you work. We're modeling how much time you spend not working or leisure. Why did we do this? Because our model only really works well if we're considering trade-offs. There's no trade-off between work and consumption. You like consumption, you don't like work. This is different from our example of pizza and cookies. If I asked, would you rather have a slice of pizza or a cookie? That'd be a hard question for a lot of people. But if I asked, would you rather have a slice of pizza or work for several hours? Most would probably choose the pizza. So labor isn't a good in our model, it's a bad. As a result, it doesn't fit nicely in the framework we've used so far in the class. We can therefore use a trick. We can model the trade-off between consumption and not working or leisure. If we use leisure, which is something people like, then we're back in the world we're used to, modeling the trade-off between two goods that people like. And once we solve for leisure, we can figure out labor easily. Note that labor is just the time left over in the day after your leisure time. That is, if two variables are linked by a mathematical identity, like saying that labor equals 24 minus hours of leisure, then we can solve for either labor or leisure in our model and just use this identity to get the other. Put all this together, and our two modeling tricks let us figure out labor supply. First, we lumped all goods into consumption, which made it easier to figure out total hours worked, and by extension, your budget constraint. Second, we analyzed leisure instead of work, so we're comparing two inputs that are goods. This type of creativity is part of the fun of economics. A lot of important advances in economics have come from these types of simplifications. Once you make them, you can explore really important questions like unemployment and wages using tools that you learn in this course.